Right, so let's build our pelvis. First, we're going to start with the pelvic floor. There's some striated muscles. I don't expect you to know the exact specific muscles, but you need to know that the pelvic floor exists and that this is the area that causes stress incontinence if it is weakened. This is the area that can be damaged by childbirth or instrumental delivery. So this is very much relevant to urogynecology symptoms. Okay, then we're going to start from the back. So right at the back here, we've got nerves. Okay, a whole lot of those. Then we've got a representation of our blood vessels that are sort of towards the midline. Okay. You need to know about the inferior vena cava, because if you have a pelvic mass, if whether it's a pregnancy or a massive fibroid or something like that, that can compromise return to the inferior vena cava. And that's why in pregnant women, you'll hear about this more in the fibroid lecture. If pregnant women have fibroids and the pregnancy itself is compressing on this venous return, instead of the venous return going back up to the heart, it actually extravasates into the fibroid itself. Okay, so there's our blood vessels. Here are our ureters. They are quite retroperitoneal. Okay, why do we care about those in gynae? Well, again, if you have a huge, gigantic pelvic mass that is compressing on the ureters, the patient can get hydronephrosis and renal failure. I'm just bringing the light closer here. Okay, so that's why you need to know about the ureters. All right, then we've got some bowel. Okay, so the Thor sock is our representation of bowel. And then between the bowel and the uterus, there's going to be some fascia. Okay, I'm just going to put the uterus in so that we can contain this whole thing. Okay, so there's your fascia, which is the rectovaginal septum at the bottom. That is relevant because, for example, if a woman has cervical cancer, they can get a fistula there and they can constantly leak stool, which is a really unpleasant symptom to have. And then on top of the rectovaginal septum is this thing called the pouch of Douglas, which kind of slots in over there. Okay, so in real life it's a little bit further down, but the pouch of Douglas is like a little fold of peritoneum that happens between the uterus and the posterior wall, and the bowel sits in between in that space. Pouch of Douglas is important because endometriotic deposits can end up in there, as well as if one were ever to see fluid in the pouch of Douglas on a scan, that's highly significant and it's not normal. So that is, for example, either going to be a ruptured ectopic or PID with pus in the pouch of Douglas, or something like an ovarian carcinoma where there is acidic fluid in the pouch of Douglas. Okay, so it's not entirely anatomically correct, but it is an important place to remember. Okay, so then we've got our uterus, and see the ovaries are going towards the back, as I've shown you. The broad ligaments are important because that is also a place where endometriotic deposits can end up. And then in front of the uterus, we've got another piece of fascia, and then we've got our bladder. So that is the vesicovaginal septum. Okay, why is that important? So number one, cervical cancer as well, with its local spread, can eat into this area, and it can cause a vesicovaginal fistula, which is also an awful thing to experience. And during Caesars, one of the things that can happen, one of the complications of a Caesar, is that the bladder can be cut close to the uterus, and then you can have a vesicovaginal fistula that has been caused by us. Okay, so what's important to appreciate about all of this is that these organs are all tightly packed in here. So it doesn't mean to say that if a woman has got a symptom of lower abdominal pain that it is necessarily the uterus that is the problem, because you've got the bladder, you've got bowel, you've got nerves. Okay, so very important. Sometimes something like a spinal stenosis with nerve compression can cause pain that radiates around to the front, and then everybody assumes that it's low abdominal pain and it's a gynae problem. Meanwhile, it's actually a lumbar spine issue. Okay, and another important thing about the nerves, again, if there's a giant pelvic mass, it can compress those nerves and cause discomfort in that way. So pain from nerve compression, and can also compress the vessels. Okay, so point number one, everything is tightly packed, and the symptoms may, low abdominal pain isn't always the uterus if you're a woman. The other thing that's very important to appreciate is that this is the anterior and that's the posterior. Where are the ovaries? They're way behind, and they're also kind of just below the pelvic brim. So when you are examining a patient, you really have to get your fingers over the pelvic brim, and you've got to feel very deeply to look for those ovaries. Okay, then I'm talking about the bimanual examination. You're never ever going to feel the ovaries unless there's a mass from the abdomen. You will only feel the ovaries if they are to be felt on a bimanual examination. And in fact, a lot of the time we don't really feel the ovaries because they're really small and they're really far behind. Okay, so that is a little crash course revision in pelvic anatomy, and that is in about as much detail as I think you need to know it for your level.